know what I'm saying. I wonder what it would be like. Do you think if anybody could ever invent a sort of photography, X-ray photography machine, imagine if they could take a photo of your soul and it would show you what the state of your soul was, or your inner world, your kind of mind. And imagine if somebody could do that now. What would it look like? I'm not going to get you to share this or anything like that. It's just a thought. But it's kind of like, where are you at? Sort of in there. You know, if you could take a photo of it, a snapshot of, say, your life, the things that you're dealing with, the things you're worried about, your secret sins and shame and your anger, your fear, your, you know, how good are you at kind of, you know, getting a measure of where you're at, or are you a little bit detached from it? Are you the sort of person who's like, oh, I don't want to think about that kind of stuff? But one of the things I feel like really conscious of is that is just that unless we deal with reality, we're just not going to get anywhere. It doesn't matter how many goals you have in life, how many things you wish you were or hope you might be, or how life could turn out. Unless we deal with reality as it is, then we're not going to move from this place, you know. And so we're in this little series, we're talking about hearing from God, and we kind of put it at the beginning of this sort of, you know, regathering after the summer, because in some ways it's just like the total essential thing for Christians, followers of God, is to be able to actually move with God. It's like you were reading that passage about Moses saying, unless we go from here, if we don't go without your, if we go without your presence, we're no one will even mark us out as being different to anyone else. And that's the thing that marks us out, is this sense of moving with God, but it has to come from reality. And so hearing from God, you can't hear if you've got this kind of thing. This is what God ought to be saying. This is what I want to happen. This is my plan for my life, and I don't care what you say, God, this is my plan for my life. If you do it like that, nothing's going to happen. And all of you, I know lots of you really well, some of you not so well, but you've got a secret life going on with God. Or you've got a secret life. It may not be going on with God. You may be getting the appearance of it, but honestly, you might be just kind of keeping it. But God is aware of you, and He is aware of your reality. He knows what you think, like why you think the things that you think, and He is the only one. He is totally unique in the world of all human experiences. The only human experience we believe is like this, is the communion of your soul with God's Spirit. There's no religion that teaches that other than Christianity. And I just kind of want to speak a bit into that today. In this series, we've been looking at Samuel and how he was born as a prophet, and we've had a couple of weeks on it about learning to hear from God. And I wasn't there for Colin and Cara's, but that was kind of like just kicking us off. And I've chosen this title, Born After Midnight. Anyone heard that before, that phrase? You're obviously not fans of A.W. Tozer, one of my great heroes in faith. He wrote a book called Born After Midnight, and he was really talking about revivals that born after midnight, and I'll go on to it in a minute, but he's really saying, unless you dispense with the kind of, the normal superficial things and things you normally pray for, and push past that into something else, he said, beyond the midnight hour, you're probably only ever going to stay on the shallows and the superficial edges of your faith, but there's something there that after midnight for those who have got that kind of sense. So that's where I got that from, and I'm a real massive fan of A.W. Tozer. So hearing from God. How do you hear from God? I'm going to read a little story now. If you put it up on the thing. Now, this is a story written by a guy called David du Plessis. Again, 100 years ago, this is when, at the beginning of the 20th century, he was a Christian teacher and leader, and he had an experience with the Holy Spirit in which he was really went from being a Christian to a Christian, and he really met and encountered God, and he started travelling around South Africa. He was born in South Africa, a white South African, born in South Africa, and he started travelling around, felt called South Africa, and just as a Christian teacher. And then one night he was on his way he was going to speak for 10 days at a mission, and a teaching sort of conference, and this happened to him. So I don't know if you can see it, I'll read it. It was early morning, around 4 o'clock in the month of January. There was snow everywhere outside, and radio news had predicted 10 degrees below zero temperature that night. I was awakened from a deep, restful sleep by a voice that seemed loud and clear. I sat up in my bed and looked around the room. The street light was shining through the window, and I saw no one in the room. All was quiet, yet that voice kept ringing in my ear. It seemed I could still hear it distinctly saying, "God has no grandsons." Perhaps I'd left the radio on. I leant over and felt the set. It was ice cold, but where did the voice come from? Who spoke these words? I kept listening, but there was only the sound of heavy breathing from those sleeping in the next room. Then it seemed as if there was someone in my room, and the presence made me feel good. Suddenly it dawned on me. It must be the Holy Spirit who spoke to me. But why should he say those words to me? What does it mean? God has no grandsons. And he continues the story in saying that he went to this mission, and he thought, as he woke up, being a good Christian leader, he thought, well, God must be using that, must be my message. And he was waiting for the next 10 days in this teaching conference. When am I going to deliver this message that I've heard from the audible voice of God? When am I going to tell people? And no opportunity, nothing came to the point where he thought, yes, this is the answer to the question. And he was disappointed. He got on the plane from Milwaukee to go home. And as they were on the plane, the message came over the tannoy that they were going to have to divert to Chicago because of bad weather, and they would be put on a different plane from Chicago. So they landed, they went on, and in the middle of the night finally got on this plane from Chicago to home. And he said it was freezing cold and there was no one there. And there was like 5 people at the gate, and he said 4 of them said goodbye to this one person, and he realised, I'm on the plane with this one person on a whole plane. And they get on the plane, and he starts to think, oh, maybe this is significant. And he speaks to the guy, and the guy says, they introduce themselves, and he says, I'm a Roman Catholic priest, but I teach other priests what to do. And he said, well, I'm a priest too. He said, okay, well, this was the beginning of the charismatic outpouring. It was in the 1920s. It was pre the big sort of 1960s thing, but it was the beginning of the kind of Pentecostalism, really, the sort of worldwide outpouring of it, where it began to move from its initial roots. And David du Plessis had been part of this kind of movement of the gospel. And he said, yeah, I'm a priest. And of course, the Roman Catholic priest didn't really think he was a proper priest, but he started to tell his story. And this priest said, something about what you were saying to me, I'm so intrigued, I have to hear your story. So he said to the air hostess, don't worry about serving us, we don't need anything, go and sleep on the front row of the seats, I'm just going to talk all night to this guy, David du Plessis. So they sat and they talked on this home journey on the plane. And all night long, David du Plessis explained to this Roman Catholic priest what he just knew he had to, this message, God has no grandsons. And he said, as he began to speak, the message gathered in his mind, and he explained how when people become Christians, the only way you can become a Christian is through an encounter with God, where you become a son of the living God, a child of God, or a daughter of God, and that is your new birth. There's no other way of becoming a Christian, not one other way. You can't slip in through any other door, you can't make it yourself, you can't do it in any other way. There's only one beginning, and it is an encounter. And if you don't have the encounter, you're not actually a Christian. And he said, the problem is, and so the priest said, so you saying that I'm not really a Christian, the church has gone wrong, and he's saying, well, yes. I'm saying that if you haven't had the encounter with God, even if you were born into the most religious family on earth, that they are the children of God. But if you haven't had an encounter yourself, if you've just been brought up and taught how to do all the stuff, then you're just a grandson. You're not a son, and God has no grandsons. He's saying this to this guy, and he was saying, so are you saying you're the only your group of, the division comes in. Only your group of Christianity is the only one that is the real children of God. And he was saying, no, we're in exactly the same problem. He said, we had a revival 20, 30 years ago, and we had loads of people became children of God. He said, but my movement is in exactly the same place. People are being born into it, and they are being brought up to be good Christians, good Pentecostals, good tongue-speaking, healing, but unless they've had an encounter with God, we're all in the same problem. There's no such thing as a grandson. He said that he looked it up. He looked up through the Bible if there was any mention of God having grandchildren. Nothing. Nada. Only children of God. And so he spent the night, and then that became his life message. He was an incredible man. We were listening to a little snippet from him on YouTube this morning, and he met Smith Wigglesworth, and Smith Wigglesworth a few years later he described this thing. He said, Smith Wigglesworth, the great prophet, he was a bit of a mad prophet guy, he was amazing, but he barged into his office one day, and he sort of got David Duplessis up against the wall like this, and sort of like hands on shoulders, and he just delivered this prophecy and then walked out. Didn't even say hello or goodbye. And the prophecy was, you're going to go to the mainstream denominational churches with the message of the gift of the Holy Spirit, which he absolutely hated the idea of it, because he thought they were all so boring and awful, and only Pentecostalism was the thing. So anyway, fascinating story, loads more to say, but I just love that story, and I've often thought about it and told it, because it gives, in a way, if we're talking about hearing from God, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the actual direct connection that you and I have with God, and there's only one direct connection. There's no other way. You cannot hear from, you can hear from God from other people, but it cannot bear fruit and ground in your life unless you've got it going on with God. You have got to have that direct connection. And so that's really that I'm just, and this stuff is, most of you know that. That didn't rock your world, did it? You know this is true. You know that you can't live your life vicariously through other people, don't you? Do we? Yes. You know you can't really be happy with somebody else's happiness, or be at peace with yourself with somebody else's peace. Even if they say a really powerful message, it doesn't really matter unless it grounds into you. It's nothing's happening. And we know this. This is what we know. But sometimes we've got to come back to it and say, am I directly connecting with God? What's it like in there, in the internal, like I was saying, the photograph of your internal world? Have you got it going on? And have I? And do I need to be reminded with all the things? Because there's so many other voices. And so I'm just going to quickly look back at Samuel's story. We told it twice now. I'm not going to tell it again, but we are going to read the next instalment of Samuel's story, or a little bit more of it. This is what David Duplessis said. This is a famous verse, and it is saying he gave the right to become, to those who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right, Jesus, to become the children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. I just want you to retain that phrase in your mind, born of God. I am born of God. That is totally different to trying to be religious. Okay, Jesus, I'm terrible with PowerPoints, and kind of like, put that in. Here we go. This is the next little bit, we're kind of going back halfway through the story, back to that familiar place. This is in Shiloh, where Sophie and Elliot in our house, by the way, had a baby last night called Shiloh.
Happy birthday.
Yes, so amazing. This is back in Shiloh, the place of the temple. Eli, if you remember, Eli and his sons, do you remember their names? Hophni and Phinehas, yeah, naughty boys, horrible, really good. And Eli, just passive, let them do whatever they wanted. Terrible regime. That's the culture, the juggernaut that's going forward, and it's awful in Israel at the time. No one can hear from God. And then Samuel, this boy, is being given as a gift to God by his mother, goes and lives in the temple, and things go on. And then this night, the thing happens which we talked about, where God calls out to Samuel, but he doesn't recognise the voice. And this is the third time Samuel has got up, and he goes to Eli, and he says again, "You're calling me, what's going on?" And again, Eli says, "Son, I didn't call you. Go back to bed." This is the Message version. This all happened before Samuel knew God for himself.
Yes.
It was before the revelation of God had been given to him personally. God called Samuel again, the third time. Yet again, Samuel got up and said to Eli, "Yes, I heard you call, here I am." That's when it dawned on Eli that God was calling the boy. So Eli directed Samuel, "Go back and lie down. And if the voice calls again, say, 'Speak, God, I'm your servant, ready to listen.'" That's a good phrase to learn off by heart. Samuel returned to his bed. Then God came and stood before him exactly as before, and calling out, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel answered, "Speak, I'm your servant, ready to listen." Next one. God said to Samuel, "Listen carefully, I'm getting ready to do something in Israel that's going to shake everyone up and get their attention. The time has come for me to bring down on Eli's family everything I warned him of. Every last word of it. It's been terrible what's been warned, you know. I'm letting him know that his time is up. I'm bringing judgment on his family for good." He knew what was going on, that his sons were desecrating God's name and God's place, Eli did. And he did nothing to stop them. "This is my sentence on the family of Eli. The evil of Eli's family can never be wiped out by sacrifice or offering." I just want you to hear what's going on here. God is telling this terrible thing that is going to happen to Samuel. It's the first message he's had from God, and it's just like a nightmare. Imagine if you had to go and give that to your person who's you're most close to, who's in charge of you. Oh my goodness. And Samuel stayed in bed, of course he did, until morning, absolutely delaying the moment. Then he rose early, and he went about his duties, opening the doors of the sanctuary, heavy in his heart, I'm sure. But he dreaded having to tell the vision to Eli. But then Eli summoned Samuel. "Samuel, my son." Samuel came running. "Yes, what can I do for you?" "What did he say?" said Eli. "Tell it to me, all of it. Don't suppress or soften one word." Eli knows, doesn't he?
Yes.
"As God is your judge, I want it all." Not word for word, everything he said to you, he knows what is coming. So Samuel said to him, word for word. He held back nothing. Eli said, "He is God. Let him do whatever he thinks best." And then this little bit ends. Samuel grew up and God was with him. And Samuel's prophetic record was flawless. It says in another version, not one word that he spoke fell to the ground. And it's amazing, this picture, this sort of intimate picture. It feels so real, like a real human, you know. Some stories you hear and you think, "Oh, is this an allegory?" This isn't an allegory. This is a human interaction. And everyone in Israel, from Dan in the north, who is Dan, his tribe, to Beersheba in the south, recognised that Samuel was the real thing, a true prophet of God. God continued to show up at Shiloh, revealed through his word to Samuel at Shiloh. It is such a sort of intimately depicted story. It, like I say, feels real, doesn't it? And I just thought there's three little things to dip into from the story, because we're going to keep going around it for 2 more weeks after this, but you put the next slide on. And this profound thought is what I came up with. It's easier to hear human voices than God's voice. Oh my goodness, is it easier? Isn't it? And what is that? Why is that important to say? Because we want to hear God's voice, don't we? As Christians, why do we want to hear God's voice? Tell me 3 reasons. We need direction. We need direction, and we don't know what to do half the time. Anything else? Affirmation. We kind of need to hear God's voice because we've got terrible self-esteem. Anything else?
Source of life.
It's a source of life. Confirmation is you want to do something, you think, is this right, is this wrong?
We're quite lazy and we want God to say something different to what we have to do.
Yeah, and we know as well he's much more intelligent than us, isn't he? So if he says to do something, he's probably right, so it's sensible to obey. So we want to hear God's voice, but the easiest voice is to hear human voices. And I think that's just so clear in this little story, because here's Samuel, who is obviously a soft-hearted boy, you know? That's the picture you get from him, don't you? He's a good, holy, maybe, pure-hearted person, ready, serving, getting up when he hears Eli's voice, running to him, he sounds lovely, doesn't he? I mean, later on in life, when Samuel speaks, you think sometimes, ooh, but at this point, he's just sounds like a soft-hearted, and he needs to hear God's voice, and why can't we sort of just get through to him? Why can't we just sort of think, oh, that sounds like God's voice, what's going on there, And I think what's happens is that he's attuned to Eli's voice. He's attuned to it. This is life, his world. Actually, Eli must be like a father to him because he's not living with his family anymore. And he's been told what to do every day, and he's attuned to it. And that's the reality, is you are attuned to people's voices in your life. And the people you're attuned to, you can hear them easily. But there might come a time when you've got to attune to God's voice very deliberately. And this is what Eli, the one good thing Eli does in this story, which commends him, I think, is that he works out what's going on. He's actually more attuned to how God speaks than Samuel is. Even with his mess and the awfulness of Eli's life, his passive acceptance of things like prostitution in the temple and all sorts of awful things and stealing, Eli still is attuned and has been able to know what God's voice sounds like, and so he's instructing Samuel in this moment. And I just think there's a little principle there. So you've got to learn to know the sound of God's voice and be attuned to it. And sometimes other human beings can help you. And the reason why we need to say that is because the voices that are loudest are often our internal fleshy voices. Our fears are really loud. The things that you just said, the reasons why we need to know. We don't know what to do. We've got these loud voices. So if, I don't know, one of the loudest times is when you fall in love. That voice is, so loud. Romance. We say sometimes your flesh is loud. And you want to know, is this the right thing for me? And you're trying to hear God, and all you can hear is the love messages, Or if you, you want to know what to do with your job or your career or your life, and it feels like there's these loud voices. And actually, the reality is God has chosen to usually have quite a quiet voice. And we've just got to put up with that because he's like that. He's not changing. And it's very rare, we know the story of Elijah, don't we? Hidden in, God says, I'm going to pass by, and then there's all the massive things that happen, and it's not till the still small voice comes that God is revealed, and that is just the way it is. So if you want to know a kind of principle of being able to hear from God, you've got to be able to dial down and hear the quiet voice. And you've got to have the wisdom to know that your own voice, you're in your head, the voices of culture, the voices of just, all sorts of things. Your anger, your fear, your passions will be loud, and God's voice will be quiet. So we have to accept that. We have to learn to attune ourselves to the voice of God, and it's going to probably be quiet. That's not the most profound thing that you could ever say, but it's just true. Okay, second thing. It's not going to be a long one, I don't think. It helps if you've got an orientation of obedience. So what I mean by that is, it doesn't help if you just obey. It helps to have an orientation in you that when you hear the instruction, before you hear it, you will try and be obedient. And it helps for you to sort that bit out before you hear God's voice, because nothing God likes less, I think, than saying something to people and then weighing up whether they think he's right and then choosing whether or not they want to obey him. I don't think God likes that kind of scenario. It's horrible if, as a parent, you feel like you're offering, you're saying, this is what I want you to do, and then sort of saying, yeah, but I don't agree with that because this is what my culture says, or this is what I think, and you think, you know nothing about anything, Labour. You're only two. As a parent, you often know, and what you want is you want to be able to say things, and for your children to be good ground for it to drop into your wisdom. So, are you a good place for God to speak, or have you got this determined, strident spirit that is determined? This is what I want. I want to be healed of this. Or I want direction of this. I want a wife by 2024. Or, it's whatever it is, if you've decided it already, and you're like, I'm naming and claiming that thing.
Yes.
I'm having it. I will declare it. And sometimes our own culture, sort of prophetic culture, can be awful, around that stuff, because you have to develop this orientation of obedience and a quietness in your spirit. You know that Psalm 131, it says, I've stilled and quietened my soul like a weaned child. Who's heard that verse? What's a weaned child?
Child to come off the breast.
Right, okay, so what's the difference between a child on the breast and a child that is weaned around their parent? If you've got a child who's still breastfeeding near a mother, what happens?
Cry all the time.
Won't listen for anything, they just want that milk. But a weaned child is able to be on their mother's lap and be quiet and be comforted and receive other things other than baby's milk.
Yes.
Sure.
So it's about maturity. It's like, have you got to a place where you know how to quieten yourself and listen to God? I'll tell you somebody who's really good at it is Flo over there. She won't like me picking her out. But, Flo's a person who's got, she's quite an emotional person, aren't you? You experience life strongly, don't you? You're a passionate lady. And, you feel things really strongly. And I've seen Flo many times in the time we've known her, living with her and stuff, is the times when, she might be in turmoil, and then she goes into her bedroom, and then she comes out, and a couple of days later, not for 2 days, but if I happen to see her a couple of days later, she will say, really had God say this or that, and I laid it all down, and it's always quite dramatic, this Flo, but it gets there, because she knows how to just get rid of her agenda and just come and listen to God. She's probably thinking, I haven't done that for ages, that's not really me, but I think that I've seen it in you, and lots of you know what I'm talking about, but we have to, you're all going through things right now. I know you are. And because I am, and we all are. And you really need to hear God's voice at the moment, don't you? You feel it. You feel that kind of dryness, or fear, or pain, or emptiness, desolation. And you know that the voice of God dropping into your soul would be wonderful, don't you? And I'm just saying to you, in Samuel's story, that's what you see, is you see this, okay, I need to learn what it sounds like even. Won't necessarily be a loud voice, but I also need to say, before he even says anything, okay, I'm open to hear what you say, and even if it's not what I want, or if I've got to do something that's really unappealing to me, I'm ready, orientated towards saying yes before you say it. I think you're more likely to hear if you cultivate that within you. And it's something that it doesn't go away as you get older. You don't become expert at this. Sometimes you do meet people and you think, wow, you've done that all your life. So we've talked about Rob and Pam Scott, their celebration of their life ministry a few weeks ago. And, really, that is what it looks like, an orientation that lasts over 30, 40, 50 years. It looks like something. It doesn't look like something on the first day, but it does on, year 50. and it looks like an enviable life. I was having coffee with Pam Scott Cook, she's 79. This week we had coffee in the Ivy. She's more nimble and agile than I am. Not just in her body, but in her brain, her mind. She is someone who is literally sailing into heaven. She's had cancer, she's had all sorts of things, but she is just, you think, wow, that is an alive person. She's 79. She feels more alive than I do. So there's a legacy that comes from doing those things. So that orientation of Samuel was so vital for what was about to happen. He was going to say yes, whatever, and he had a very hard thing to do, saying yes to. And then, in this midnight hour, it's all dark, Eli sends him back on his own, and he knows that in a minute, God is going to speak out loud to him. And I wonder if he's like, oh my goodness. And one of the things I've noticed doing lots of prayer with people for a long, long time, 30 odd years now, is that I feel like one of the things that I do is try and help people to connect to God. And I've got some ways, and I'm not bad at it, I think. And people do sometimes find they connect with God praying with me. But one of the things I've really noticed is that you can go so far with someone on their journey, and you can build up quite a lot of skill and experience and knowledge and know your Bible and help them. But there comes a point where it's like a threshold where they've got to go in on their own into their relationship with God, and no one can go with them. And it's like it's the midnight hour, it's the moment when you're alone with God. And I think a lot of us Christians have a very minimal amount of that, really going in on our own. We love the worship communally. You feel, I really feel like I experienced God this morning. Those sorts. We love the prophetic word from somebody else who, that's exactly what I needed to hear. We love all these sorts of things, but actually we don't possibly love the idea of being alone with God, stripped naked before him in the midnight hour, and there's no one encouraging you, and maybe he's going to say something you don't want to hear, and your heart is kind of like, oh. And yet Jesus says that those who are born of God, that is what is going to happen. The Holy Spirit will come to those who are born of God. You're born of the Spirit, and it only looks like that intimate thing on your own. And Jesus said, my sheep know me, they hear my voice, they know my voice, and they follow me. You cannot even be a Christian unless you have this thing. And I'm not talking about an encounter where you're overwhelmed. It might be really awful. I'm sure they wouldn't mind me saying this, but Sophie and Elliot had a baby last night, and the baby was born by emergency C-section in the last minute. And but Sophie said that she had this, it was very, I'm sure that's disappointing to them, because they really were hoping to have a natural birth. But she said she had this amazing sort of encounter with Jesus as she was going down into anesthesia, and she saw Jesus and saw him weeping with her. And she said that, it sort of led to probably the most powerful encounter with Jesus she's ever had. And she's going into one of the hardest things she could ever do, which is, and I just think, for me, those guys are examples of people who've got this, this is what we want. We've had some prophetic words saying it's going to be great, and it's not. And yet, I have got this connection with Jesus that makes it possible for for it to make sense in a way that it doesn't in worldly ways. And I just want to know if all of us have got that kind of hunger, like appetite to be people, not just who sort of ride up everyone else's momentum, but have got your own momentum going on with Jesus. And so that even when really hard and difficult things happen, or you have to give a message that's really difficult, you're like, yes, God, that's the only thing that really gives me life. And then just finally to say this, actually our identity, our purpose, and our health, mental, emotional, physical health, pivot on being able to hear God for ourselves. And if you're in a place where you feel like, I don't know who I am, and I'm not sure what my purpose is, and I'm feeling quite unhealthy, there is something that God is saying to you. And you need to strive with all your heart and soul to strip away your agenda and say whatever you want to say. Speak, Lord, I'm listening. And be willing to push past the kind of boredom of waiting to hear God's voice, the fear of hearing something that you don't want to hear, and all the other stuff, your agendas and everything. If you want to be someone who knows who you are and feel healthy in your soul and have a sense of your own purpose, the only way you'll get it is if you're living responsibly to the voice of God, and it's not an easy thing to do. I would say it is for, as Tozer would say, next slide, I think it's the next one, there is no merit in late hour prayers, but it requires a serious mind and a determined heart to pray past the ordinary into the unusual. Most Christians never do, and it is more than possible that the rare soul who presses on gets there after the midnight hour. And why? Because it's nothing about the late hour prayers, but it's that oh God, I've got to live in response to your voice. I want to hear your voice. And I have got an agenda. I'll admit it, God. I'd like you to do these things. But actually, I'm willing to just say, I don't care what you say to me as long as you speak. I want to be a person who hears the voice of God. And in some ways, that's kind of pretty much it in terms of what I feel out of that passage. I don't think we're going anywhere as LoveBristol. We could do with a word from God at the moment. We could do with a travelling prophet coming through and saying, wow, LoveBristol, I prophesy that you are going to be 500 people in the next 6 months. Get ready, open your building, outbreaks of this. We would love that. But we don't know what God's voice is saying to us, actually. We have a sense of carrying on at the moment. But we want to be a community of people who communally live in response to God's voice. But it's not going to happen unless individually we have that kind of reality check. God, if you can see my soul, which you can, this is the reality of it. These are the things I'm grappling with at the moment. I put aside my agendas and I want to say to you that I'm surrendered to hear your voice. I surrender. We have a little motto in our family. If in doubt, surrender. It's kind of like that is what you do when you relate to God. It always comes circles round to the same point. Surrender. It's like, in chemistry, if in doubt, it turns blue. If in doubt, surrender. That's what Christianity has got at the core of it. So, yeah, those are my offerings.
Thank you.